Hey, this is Christian Buckley, and this is another episode of Digital Sack Lunch, and I'm here with Michael. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Michael Hiles. I am CEO of a company called 10XTS.
Well, you got to share more than that, like where you
Oh, you
are,
want to
your
know more?
experience around there.
Okay, sure. Right. So I started developing as a kid in the late 1970s. I got really super lucky. My dad worked for a company called Syncom Systems. So next year I will have been coding for 40 years.
Wow.
Started out on a PDP-11 with a die-ball compiler. And so it's just been one technology cycle after another. But about 2.5 years ago, which is, it's interesting because back when I was working in the SharePoint space, Bitcoin
We were talking about that for those that don't know. So Michael and I have known each other for a few years through the Microsoft SharePoint ecosystem there, and kind of kept in touch. And one of the first, Michael, you've been like posting a ton of stuff out there on various cloud topics, but certainly a lot about blockchain the last couple of years as well.
Yeah. So I was in stealth mode for a little bit, but it's interesting. I literally mined Bitcoin when it was mineable on just a regular processor, and you didn't need ASICs and all that good stuff. So, but it was about 2011, 2012, I really saw the potential, but it was still such a nascent technology at that time. And so I just kept tabs on it, played around with it, mined a bunch, bought a bunch, sold it all way too soon. I contend that, eventually in future iterations of the DSM, there'll be a form of depression called crypto regret.
Well, hey, there's a, I mean, even with it had dip. Of course, now we're dating, time stamping the video, its value here by talking about that. But it's been down for a while. But there's a number of very reputable people that are saying, so there's a bunch of stuff that's coming up that's gonna.
There is. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff.
So there's a lot happening in the space. It certainly isn't the, hey, you've missed that whole window to go on that side of it.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's just, it's funny. So, I'm based in Cincinnati, and it was it was like spring of 2016. And I had been paying attention particularly to Ethereum, because that's when things really started to get interesting, because of course, you have consensus models and hashing. I mean, let's face it, like Zookeeper has been part of Hadoop for how long now when it comes to, forms of distributed, decentralized, consensus. And, these things are not new, as we were talking before you started the podcast. I mean, how long's Token Ring been around? So,
it's actually one of the criticisms I hear from people that come from, the database management world, that they say like, hey, but there's really like this all hype around this, like these different various technologies. You got to separate though. It's some of the core technologies that made it possible might be really old, but certainly the application and certain principles are new.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure when Napster was around and you were downloading MP3s, I mean, the decentralized trading of MP3s versus now it's a hash key pair, right? So I mean, it's blockchain's Napster for math. And it's a way I like to describe it to the uninitiated. But it was really when Ethereum started to take off, and I saw that it was transitioning from just a consensus modeling with a token-based approach. It was like, hey, you know what? There's going to be an emergence of enterprise use cases around this. Yeah. And to your point, and to your your database administrator colleagues' criticisms that sure, blockchain is not the answer to every technology problem. I'm absolutely adamant against running around with a hammer looking for the nail, right? I mean,
right. I likened it to the the .com era, and I had my software company, and I remember going to pitch events, and we pitched our company. We were one of those struggling technology companies that we had our provisionals that were out. It was real technology. We had customers. We had a little bit of revenue coming in, but we went and built technology that actually worked and did what we said. Right. We'd go to these pitch events, and these guys that were still like millions of dollars off of notes on napkins kind of stuff, and just some incredibly stupid ideas that they just put kind of a .com after it. Literally, right. That's what they did. And so. I was just going to say, the end of January, went to this event, and it was like this. There was panels and guys that were talking about it and saying, and here's what we did. And we said, we saw this opportunity. They saw the money raising, that kind of Kickstarter capability of the token offerings. And there's no other application of it other than fundraising. And we've got to clean
unfortunately, the ICO market and a lot of the altcoin space has really hurt the underlying technology, particularly from the enterprise side. And, when I decided to launch 10xts, I spent a year in R&D mode. I went out and I started researching other consensus models and really putting together a lab so that we can understand what types of consensus models, what types of data structures, transaction protocol structures are out there to serve different needs. Because even in the blockchain space, proof of work has proven itself to be great to get the technology going, but it's certainly with the network latency and the inability to really embed a lot of metadata into the transaction, the token, there are certainly limitations around that. And then of course, the hype took off, and it certainly was a bunch of startups and scammers even, looking around saying, hey, this is a great way to raise a heck of a lot of money.
And they did. Yes.
And they continue, right? I mean, we're like double at this time right now where we were at closing the year out last year globally in terms of capital formation. And
in fact, it's outpaced the traditional venture capital, and that kind of private equity investment. It's crazy. I mean, the numbers and the growth.
It has. Yeah, it has. But unfortunately, because of the hype, it has really hurt the underlying. And I set out to really identify the second wave. I'm an old dog like you, and been through multiple technology cycles, and it's always the second wave guys are the ones that are sustainable, just like the .com era. And it's funny because I'm literally having identical conversations around blockchain right now with kids that I was having with the crypto punk, early days of the internet. Information democracy is going to bring down the man. It's like, oh my gosh, this is like Groundhog Day. It's like, wait, I've had this conversation like a long time ago. And and I saw that there was a gap from where we were at in the cryptocurrency market and where we were headed in the cryptocurrency market. And then there was going to certainly be the trough of disillusionment, like every other technology market that emerges. And then the sustainable companies, the real true hypergrowth companies over the long tail, were going to be the ones that actually figure out how to take the core technology into Main Street. But unfortunately, the perception right now, when you go talk to CIOs, is like, is that Bitcoin? Wow, we don't want any of that around here.
Well, it's funny. I was at a Microsoft Build conference. I didn't attend Build. I had other meetings in town, and I went to. There's a bunch of regional director, MVP, events, things going on around the conference, and we had Mark Rusinovich come out and present to us at one lunch, and a few other folks, and. Was interesting that we had the Azure blockchain and team, so an engineering lead and somebody that's over on the the program development side of things, and and they got up and presented this short segment on that, and it was almost immediate, like the pushback from the audience. It wasn't a Microsoft thing; it was against blockchain and stuff. And a lot of the questions were there was no separation of the currency side of it, and the what attracted me was the infrastructural aspect of the technology itself.
That's all that matters.
And so what's interesting is that my observation from that, and I've talked with contacts guy JT Rose at Microsoft about this. I just saw him in Vegas earlier this month at the Microsoft Inspire, was how when you go out any discussion around blockchain, you have to be a section of it do the educational aspect.
Yes.
Because even for the people that say that they get it, they don't get it. And you've got to go through and kind of foundational to be able to then have the conversation about what it can do.
Yeah. And part of the challenge is a lot of the blockchain kids, and I call them kids because that's what they are largely, you look at the cryptocurrency industry and, blockchain technology to date, they're young people who have never necessarily worked in a leadership capacity inside of an enterprise IT organization. So when I walk around and I say things like, well, I question whether or not Ethereum's entire data set on the ledger is ever going to be SOX compliant, right? We literally have prediction markets on that data utility, on that ledger for assassinations, right? Augur, that's like one of the big popular things, betting on who's going to get killed. Like, the Bitcoin, if I operate a node for Bitcoin mining and I have an entire copy of the ledger on that node, well, there are links to child pornography contained in that ledger. So if some, like really hot shot U.S. attorney wants to come along and, make a point or make a case, at what point is my data stack at risk because I've decided to develop on top of that? And so it makes me a really unpopular guy in the crypto space because I talk about things like risk and compliance and governance. And it's like, oh, go away, you're raining on our parade. And I'm like, well, but that's a reality when it comes to the CIO view. And, you look at the leadership view. And so I think the other piece that's missing out of the equation is a lot of the blockchain kids and the blockchain purists. You have the Bitcoin purists, like they don't even want to recognize any other form of consensus model. And I would say we're probably at the fourth generation, call it blockchain 4.0 at this point, because, we went through the initial inception with proof of work as a consensus model. And then some other people started tweaking with algorithms and say, well, you know what, there might be better governance structures for this. So you had some other alts that came along very early, Ripple, for example. Of course, Stellar's a fork of that. And you have that 2.0 iteration where it's no longer proof of work and no longer Bitcoin. Then you have 3.0, which is, what I would call the Ethereum, the Ethereum virtual machine, EVM, smart contracts, being able to run code in a completely distributed environment, which I actually have less of an interest in from a use case standpoint. I think that's a huge risk. My approach is only put on the blockchain what needs to be on the blockchain, and that's typically a time date stamp of the transaction with some minimal metadata, because you're really trying to prove the efficacy of the transaction.
Right.
All the other extended metadata can be pointed to in other repositories and stores, right? But the idea of I'm going to serialize every blob of every document of every workflow, and I'm going to store that in a Turing complete chunk of code. It's just it's not practical when it comes to what an organization needs in particular. And then I look at 4.0, which is really the march to enterprise at this point. And it's, how do you define those proofs of concept, those proofs of technology from an enterprise Main Street standpoint, and then look at the array of different options that are available to you in terms of protocols, consensus, integration. And that's really where I wanted to land. And it's been sort of a timing the market thing for us, because my goal was making blockchain easy to develop against at the services level. So what we've been working on is ultimately a interface layer, API microservices layer that allows you to easily consume the webhooks and the endpoints to develop.
I was just going to say that maybe you should also, as you go through some of this again, remind viewers, listeners that company name and your website.
10xts.com. At Michael Hiles on Twitter. 10xts 10xts.com is the company. And so we have a flagship product that we've kind of been in stealth mode working against. So it's always been a delicate balance to, how do you get out and promote your brand, promote the space that you're in, but really keep it on the down low about what you're working against. So what we've built is essentially an adapter layer that allows us to connect. I went out and I identified, I did a review of about 2,000 different tokens and did a comprehensive study on different consensus models, distilled it down to roughly around 50. There's about 50 different consensus models in existence. Some new ones are coming online, Avalanche, and which is an evolution of Snowflake. But certainly all 50 of those consensus models are not going to survive. It's just like, you've got efficiencies and tweaks for different things. But what we decided to do was build essentially a middleware layer that allows us to wrap a blockchain consensus protocol with an API microservices layer, and then switch out your consensus model. And so it's interesting because Azure right now with blockchain as a service and Bletchley, and you even look at the Oracle stack, everybody's focused on Hyperledger Fabric, because that's like the low hanging fruit. It's sort of the all purpose, every person's ledger. And it's a good stack. It's good technology. It's a little slower. Once you start to hit certain transaction thresholds, you really have to get into some serious architectural planning around your node implementation. If you want to use tokens, you have to specifically code those in. So it's not necessarily native token support, but practical Byzantine fault tolerances. PBFT is a great consensus model. However, even Apache and Hyperledger has sort of abandoned that with the move to some of the other Hyperledger stacks now. So, you have the proof of elapsed time, which is the consensus model for Sawtooth. Well, that's Intel hardware specific. It uses a time date stamp on the chip to actually proof the transaction as opposed to PBFT. So you have all these different tweaks on these different consensus models, and it's really tough for a lot of people to say, well, why is one better than another? Because blockchain itself is so new. It's such a new emerging. People don't realize the very fine layers and the fine tweaks and differences between these things. So we saw the need to say, hey, you know what? In the end, if this thing's going to hit Main Street, it has to be easy to develop against, and it has to be adaptable to different types of consensus models.
So you're talking about building the middleware. I know that there's efforts, a few different things around there. We were talking about before we got started here about a little bit about what Microsoft is doing in this space, and because they seem to be taking kind of a similar approach to that, saying, hey, look, for this to be expanded to the enterprise. There's just certain infrastructure and platform components that we can go and build that don't make that don't point you any one direction. Obviously there has to be support to the various models that are out there, and the various connectors and things, but that they are leaving that up to you to say, hey, look, because in the future, I think they agree with you, is that a solution you may go and build may actually plug into multiple models. It's going to be more complex than that. And you need to be able to swap those things out as technology evolves. If you find that you're hitting the limits of one, and suddenly there's an expansion, a leapfrog over here, and be able to move things over.
I need to adapt it, right?
Right.
There has to be a path to evolution and adaptation to whatever the next thing is going to be. And probably the bigger problem, the technology, in my view, only represents maybe 15-20% of the overall effort. What they don't tell you about blockchain and enterprise blockchain applications, and this is probably where the DBAs are like, oh, you can just throw that on a SQL Server or MongoDB,
right.
Why do you need that?
Right.
Well, the power of a distributed ledger is not in the one-to-one use case, because if I don't trust my information stack inside of my own organization, that's a different problem. It's like if my supply chain management between divisions is broken and I can't trust transactional models, that blockchain is not going to solve that problem. That is a leadership issue. That's a company issue. What they don't teach you about blockchain and blockchain use cases, though, is how to design a consortium and how to actually design use cases across what I call a value constellation. So every company has its own value chain. It's producing its value proposition, and it's got its customer base, and it's got its supply chain. But the downstream output from that company affects other people. And being able to get into not just a one-to-one, but a one-to-two or a one-to-five, right?
Yep.
And so, I was talking to a very large automotive manufacturer last week, came to town to visit, and I got the opportunity to address their senior leadership. And like, well, hey, we're aware of supply chain. What's a use case? What are use cases for the automotive industry other than supply chain, and why would we want to do it? So, well, why you would want to do it is obviously because that positions you as a leader in information systems and automotive. And, you guys are creating what I call, in my career, I've always looked to what I call the genesis position. When is a brand new data object being created? If you control that, you're controlling everything downstream. Well, an automotive manufacturer is the genesis position for this little thing called a VIN number, right? So if you create, say, an automotive industry consortium framework that's not just the manufacturer, but the dealer, right? The Department of Transportation at the state level that's creating the title around the VIN number.
Mm-hmm.
The Secretary of State, where the lender is actually filing a UCC filing for the note against the vehicle, right, as collateral. And then you get into the financial aspect of it, the mortgage itself, the loan, all of these things. And you start to look at all of the interconnected, interrelated players that are ultimately using a common set of data object that starts at the manufacturer, right? So that's why you would want to do it. And if you build out that consortium framework and you bring those actors in, and, Christian, you're involved in, various IT associations across industries. I mean, industry associations at particularly the vertical level are usually pretty abysmal at IT standards and
Really,
data.
yeah, really hard to. No, I've been part directly involved with. I was mentioning like that part of the in the Global Grid Forum. I was on the Marketing Awareness Council, and and so my co-founder, my CTO of my startup back in the late '90s was led a number of working groups as part of some of the standards, and to go and then the company that I sold that company and went on to another very well funded startup in the supply chain. High-tech supply chain collaboration space. And again, we had some of our executives that were involved in various, standard bodies, how slow it is to get that consensus to move forward, which is another argument for, speeding up that process of consensus.
Absolutely.
And building trust there so that it's, because when you make a process, I have a kind of a phrase that I use all the time, like that I usually use it in reference to like end users and IT building systems, saying that the more that you involve people in the process and the creation of the process, the more likely they are to support the process. Because when you have that transparency, that visibility, they've got a voice in there. Even if they don't agree with all the decisions, that the process is fair when it's and equitable when it's transparent. And people then understand, hey, we had fewer votes, but we had the what it needed to move forward. I agreed with. If it has a majority of votes, it moves forward and it goes. And then once it's part of that system of record, it's blockchain is very much a follow the law of the land. It kind of decides how we've agreed as part of this and with this protocol, how it moves forward and to leverage that. I was actually going to say that to interrupt the point on that, but it was that my experience with in that supply chain space. Like you talked about, how did you phrase it? I think of like hub and spokes, but you've got like that OEM that goes and wants to build that network that might own that blockchain and they own that VIN for that vehicle. And then you have all the various components, the tiers that are off there. I mean, what we were doing in the early 2000s with this other startup was essentially the same thing. We were going in and we were trying to move manufacturing organizations away from the very expensive EDI-based communication and the inability, impossible technologically, to have real-time or near real-time view into their supply chain and what was happening. And so we helped drive this as participating in those standards bodies and drive this new technology. And I've got one patent to my name. We filed like a dozen that I participated in. You know how it happens. Consolidates down and only took 7.5 years, I think, for the patent to go through. But around this very topic of you build this centralized hub. So you'd have one of the clients, one of the founding investors in the company was Hitachi, and Hitachi built this hub, and then they wanted all their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers to feed into that. And so they control, just like in your example, the VIN, the power of having that and all of their players within that and this rapid communication. But what that solution lacked, and where I saw the vision for where blockchain could help with that scenario, is that we built separate hubs because of the lack of trust between Hitachi and their competitors. That they would want to go out and build their own hub. They don't want to go join the same hub as Hitachi or any other electronic vendor competitor, even though their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers globally might partner with and provide parts to several of these other competing manufacturers. But by putting this out there, one, it's from the security standpoint, you start to then benefit from the network effect. You've got it's able to scale, and you get these efficiencies of scale because you go into this network of electronics manufacturers, no matter who the OEM that you're working with or where you are within the value chain there, but you're able to benefit from that. And it's almost like I was telling my kids, was my youngest son who just turned 18, about like eBay and how great it was. And at the same time, it wrecked so many things from a supply chain standpoint for somebody that used to buy and sell a lot of rare vinyl and other music artifacts. And it basically just knocked all of that out because suddenly anyone anywhere could go and find that. But then what it also did is drive down the cost of those things and make it possible for specialized services. And blockchain, in my mind, it might sound a little scattered here as I go around this, in my mind it all comes together, but that you then have, to your example, that one manufacturer that controls that VIN, but all those different partners that are out there that plug into that, yet that they can replicate what worked with that manufacturer, that auto manufacturer, with every other manufacturer that they provide to, and look for efficiencies and do it securely. So even though it's the same network, broader network, there's no danger of the wrong data getting in there and what happened to transactions. So anyway, that's how I kind of piece it together in my mind, you know.
Yeah, you got it. You're on it. And, you know, unfortunately, no one teaches these things, you know, particularly at the blockchain level, right? You know, there's no, how do you design a consortium or a value constellation? And then it gets into, you know, it's back to the point you made earlier about the transparency and being able to weigh in. If I decide that I want, as a CIO, I'm going to say, okay, well, I'm going to integrate some line of business application into the EVM and use Ethereum. What is my voice in how my data utility is being managed? Unless I'm running $500 million worth of mining equipment,
right?
I don't get a vote. So I've got all these other people that are out there, and so, you know, we've gravitated more towards, in particular, you know, some staking models, because at least in terms of the semi-private consortium standpoint, everybody's known actors anyway. So the requirement for anonymity and high proofs when it comes to the math to determine, you know, the validity of the transaction, these are all known players. And it reduces that security requirement in terms of the transaction, the blocks being written to the ledger. It increases the throughput, right? We don't have the network latencies. And it also provides the constituents of that ecosystem with a say-so, a relevant say-so, right? And it doesn't require me to have to install version, 4.1.1 of the current mining software. And we've already seen, in particular with public cryptocurrency networks and ledgers, there's been some pretty radical forks. You know, when the miners disagree and they don't get along, and, miners are mercenaries, right? They're only going to do what's good for them in the short term, right? Which is why I don't think Ethereum will ever move to proof of stake. The miners are making too much money off of POW right now. And I love Vitalik Buterin, he's a brilliant guy and, really, created a global phenomenon. That's like super, super awesome success and, achieve what most never will. But at the same time, I look at the practical realities of the Ethereum community, the Ethereum network being held hostage to the short-term approach to the money. And there are already many other consensus models that are out there that provide a governance body. There's a framework for voting on parameters of the chain and the difficulty, and, how fast blocks are being produced, and all of those things that forced, Bitcoin Cash to fork from Bitcoin, right? It was a fundamental argument between the economic modeling of, well, it's a store of value. No, it's a form of payment. No, it's a store of value. No, it's a form of payment. Split. Well, if I've built a line of business or integrated a line of business application on top of a data utility that I don't control and that is at risk of forking, so I may have to, recode against that if I decide to go with the other fork. Or just the idea that there's a copy of my legacy data that's out there on some ledger that I'm not even involved with anymore, that sort of bugs me as a CIO, right? I don't like that from a governance or risk, compliance standpoint. I don't know if, especially as a reporting company, if I would ever pass a SOX audit for those kinds of things.
Right. Well, that's why I agree with your assessment where you talked about initially of keeping it what's actually out on that public ledger. Very simple. Keep it very basic. That it's
Sure.
as a purpose of to basically validate, hey, what you're doing elsewhere, and where it can point to and refer to that process, and in the enterprise side, workflow and everything else that will happen once you confirm that that metadata that transaction happened, but
Right.
let the processing happen elsewhere.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've done is we've actually, as part of our protocol, we've integrated workflow automation, so that we're back-ended with a business rule engine. And so the transaction doesn't actually get submitted for processing until you've completed all of those workflow requirements. That may be getting an e-signature on a contract, that may be, getting an approval, all of these other things, because the transaction actually happening on the ledger is the result of a whole bunch of activity upstream, and then it will create a whole bunch of more activity downstream once the transaction occurs. And so, we have been on the forefront of a lot of the cryptocurrency conversations. I'm ended up a registered lobbyist in DC, not because I wanted to, but because I was spending so much time there. And I get, my law firm said, yeah, you really ought to register.
Yeah, we're involved with. It was actually the company that working for is the CMO. It's in fact, I don't know if you ever knew Gary Smith, who was we joined Gary after leaving Microsoft, and it was his company Echo Technology that got bought by Acceler, and then good friends. And I was an advisor for 2 years before we came out of stealth earlier this year with about 100 filed patents. So moved from provisional over, we came out of stealth. So very big IP play around the company Reveal It. But one of the things that Gary's tried to be very involved in what's happening in Wyoming and Colorado and Nevada was actually there and presented to the legislators, or the state legislature in Wyoming.
Yeah, I got really super lucky because my congressman is Congressman Warren Davidson. I'm in Ohio 8th, and he's on the House Subcommittee for Financial Services, and he was dubbed by the committee chair to actually start working on the draft of whatever House legislation that they're going to try to propose and get out. So all of a sudden, and I actually knew Warren when he was campaigning. He replaced Boehner. I was in Boehner's district. And
okay.
So I knew Warren when he was running for the special election to replace Boehner. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, Hiles.
I know. And you know a guy who's suddenly I knew there was a reason why we barbecued that summer. So there's I just was thinking too is maybe get your thoughts on this of what is really necessary to see the embrace by the enterprise of blockchain technology. We've talked about a couple things about one, making it possible for enterprise engineering to go and develop against. I mean, now it's such a what's the right way to phrase it? It's like I think about the early days of the personal computer, where it was a hobbyist to go in there, and you had to have deep technical understanding, and you had to break out the soldering iron, in those years, and so we're kind of making that same transition within the blockchain space, where today it's like you've got to have that engineering background. I'm a marketing guy that's been in IT for 30 years, understand a lot of the concepts, but I'm not the guy that's going to go and build the things. I understand though the business application of those things, right. And I'm just interested to get your perspective on what else needs to happen for the enterprise to really embrace the technology.
Well, in the end, it is like the early days of the internet, when it was incredibly painful to just simply connect to the network, and you had to go about 40 steps to actually connect and dial the modem, and it was not a good user experience. It was relegated to the hobbyists and the uber nerds, and it was only when AOL started shipping, CD-ROMs to everyone to, hey, make it easy to get your email, right? Just think in terms of email in the days of command prompt, right? I mean, I used email via command prompt.
Early days, yep.
So, all of a sudden, how does this become consumer friendly? Well, they shouldn't. It's like it's like the engine in your car, right? If I want to go somewhere, I want to get in my car and I want to drive there. I want to know that the engine is there and it's working, but I don't need to see it. I don't want to hear it. And to me, the user experience should be no different than what I already see. It's numbers on a screen, right? It's presented in a user interface and in a context that already makes sense to me as a non-technical user. I shouldn't have to, jump through flaming hoops, and I shouldn't even be aware that it's blockchain, because that doesn't solve my problem. I don't care about that. That's
Right.
completely irrelevant to me. Blockchain solves value chain and organizational problems, but at the end user level,
Right.
doesn't matter.
Well,
So that's where our approach was. It's not, and I love all the startup kids. And, I run a startup accelerator. I run the Cincinnati chapter of the Founder Institute, which is the world's largest idea stage accelerator based in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. And, number one, raising many millions of dollars in a new and novel way does not improve your chances of success as a startup founder. In fact, it works against you probably.
Right. Actually, yeah, you lose the hunger, and that's when the companies. Yeah, I've been part of a couple, multi hundreds of $1 million, VC investment startups that had beautiful offices.
Yeah.
When they went out of business
and cash burn, and the flip side of that is no one's going to replace their existing line of business application with your cute little dApp.
Yeah.
Right. And so we took the approach of, we don't need to have our brand on the front end of everything. If we're really the connectivity layer, there's already in every vertical, in every space, there's a line of business application that somebody is eventually going to want to connect transactions to some other form of ecosystem sharing. And if we make the tool sets available to allow them to easily do that, then they just stay in their native application. There's no reason for them to know that the blockchain is even there. So that's number one. Number two, when Gartner calls me up and wants to know about what's going on in the blockchain space, you look at the numbers, right? You look at the hard numbers. Right now, only around 1% of reported CIOs for the year 2017 to 2018 were actually actively spending on blockchain. However, 9% were actively researching and planning. So if you say, well, maybe half of those will convert to an active project, that's still like a 4x increase over current spend. So that's just that cusp of the market. When he was like, oh my gosh, blockchain's over. I'm like, we haven't even started to crest.
Right.
We're not even on the upswing yet when you look at it in terms of enterprise. Yeah. Cryptocurrency as a fad and FOMO hype, that's probably over, especially, in the United States. Maybe not so much globally, but so it is an education-based discussion, number one. And the number one concern that's reported is regulatory risk, right? Now, how much of that is regulatory risk in terms of my supply chain? Well, there could be some regulatory risk in terms of, does, customs accept a tokenized bill of lading as a form of bona fide data? Sure. But it's that cross-pollination between the cryptocurrency crap and, the blockchain. Is like, oh my gosh, I'm afraid that the SEC or the CFTC or, somebody's going to come in and put the whammy. So I can't spend money on a practical, line of business use case because I don't know if they're going to ban this stuff, right? Which is ludicrous. It's mind-blowing, right? But it is a reality. So we're going to have to let the dust settle a little bit on a lot of that nonsensical cryptocurrency, Bitcoin billionaire kind of conversation.
Yeah.
And there's going to have to be some relevance based on real world proof of technologies, real world proof of concepts.
I think that's, and we're seeing, we just barely scratched on, you made the comments about what's happening in the ICO space and fundraising, and part of what's happening. And I look at it as kind of a maturing in that space where, these companies are now, or investors, well, yeah, so look, it's still hot in some areas. It certainly, I think, is started to cool down in many other spaces. So if you go and look at Puerto Rico and South Korea and in other markets where there are strong support for the bit economy, there's cooling off in some of those investment areas. But what's happening is that these investors, certainly the larger individual investors and the and larger consortiums are saying, hey, we want to see your milestones. We want to see that there's actual,
Right.
like you're developing
Absolutely.
this. It's not a, it's no longer a, hey, yes, this is a giant Kickstarter to go, and then you'll go start building it and then fail.
Sure.
We've seen too many of those, but even to hit those, as you hit those milestones and slower, so it slows down that money raising process, but it means that you're removing a lot of the risk of the investment around that. But the other thing, I was going to make one other point too about the the risks with what certainly the U.S. government will make is of course there's always a risk with any investment, blah blah blah. There's a risk of, if the U.S. comes out, what does that do to the efforts of that company as a whole? But there's the danger for the U.S., the market, for investors, and even for enterprises that might want to take advantage of that innovation, is that not that it will go away because the U.S. comes down and says, hey, we're not going to approve this type of structure, but that business then just goes away and doesn't become available in the U.S. And so then there's technical advantages, outside of the U.S., and that could hurt,
it already has
that direction.
I mean, it really already has. The flip side of the coin with the VC side, I get, and I absolutely about keeping them hungry, keeping them moving towards the milestones, but every subsequent round results in a dilution to the founder team, right? And, getting diluted out of your own company is no joyous conversation for anyone. And we are talking about technologies with very long development cycles. I don't even want to talk about the sales cycle at this point, because I have no idea, the average customer acquisition cost and sales cycle for us, is like, well, I don't know.
That's another reason why I like the whole concept of the utility token and that aspect of it. It's not just that there's the investment aspect of that. And I mean, like, one answer for the US as well. So this is getting the weeds of the threaded.
Yeah, there is, but I have a solution for that. So we're actually raising another small round, but we're doing it through a regulation crowdfunding project. So we're going to go after a full $1 million. And then, obviously we use the capital and tease us up strategically, but we've designed this intentionally because we wanted to raise the money through selling shares in the company.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're doing is we're giving our investors our product, which is actually the token.
Right.
And I've spent about 120 grand in legal fees so far, in R&D for legal, to determine, you're old enough to remember, computing service centers, right? You rented the processor by the minute, you took your program, you got your green bar and a bill for how long the processor ran. Stored computing power, right? Well, that's ultimately what you're doing with a blockchain. You're compensating someone else to use their computing power to write a block and to maintain your data. So we created what we call the microservices token, and that is a stored computing capacity. And the bearer of that microservices token is entitled to the use of the computing services available across the blockchain. That specific microservices token is not transferable. It is not tradable. So therefore, the SEC cannot come back and claim to us that we're giving our investors bonus tokens, which tees us up to actually sell them, because we've removed the profit potential for that token.
Yep.
As a use case, so we don't violate the Howey test, which is what the government uses as a landmark Supreme Court case to determine whether something's a security or not. And when I speak, it's like, hey, I can turn this water bottle into a security, right? So, hey, Christian, buy this water bottle from me for $100. You'll be able to sell it next week for $1,000, right? In that instance, because of how I talked about this water bottle, I turned it into a security according to the definition. Part of that from the Howey test is if somebody buys something with the presumption of profit that they are running up against, and in particularly presumption of profit through the efforts of third-party management. I'm not an attorney, go talk to your attorneys, but I spend a lot of money with attorneys right now. So what we determined was if we just simply define a use case to get value into the blockchain, as long as that token is not transferable or tradable, and then people say, well, why would I want that token? Well, because it's convertible into our internal chain value token. I don't want to call it a currency token because that's really not the use case. But the actual value token, and we've been very careful to mine those tokens, not pre-mine them, according to the FinCEN and the OCC standards of, all the stuff was deliberated in 2013, 2014, when the Treasury Department came out with a series of pronouncements, which, is the legal basis of why Bitcoin is legal.
Yeah.
Right. Why is it a convertible virtual currency? Why is it a commodity token?
Yeah.
Well, as long as you are maintaining that specific path, then there's no problem creating those tokens, but we don't want to sell those tokens directly to the market, because then we have to have like money, MSB license, money services, business licenses, all of those kinds of things, because they're worried about people transferring funds and, all the things that you got to go through from a KYC, AML perspective. So what we just said is, okay, this is simple. This is a simple solution. We create a microservices token. We create an actual services contract. I mean, look, we pay for metered API access now, right? So, and you brought up Rational, right? You guys sold Rational. Mm-hmm. So Rational actually was an experiment for a floating token license by IBM about 10 years ago, where if I have a company that, I have distributed workforce that needs to license the application, but they don't all need it at the same time.
Right.
So I can have a floating license, and it's
that other company. It was the spinoff company. I wrote on their blog. Anyway, Catapults.
Yeah.
That was so. That. That's what that was.
So that was the pioneer of the floating license, the floating pooled license concept. And then if you look at the landmark case, which unfortunately Microsoft, lost in Europe, but the aftermarket trading of licenses. Mm-hmm. And now in Europe you have ad hoc exchanges springing up all over Europe where people are selling off their licenses on the aftermarket. There's incrementally precedences that are there for each and every single piece of this. So what we're ultimately doing with the regulation crowdfunding campaign is saying we're raising our money through sale of stock and equity. Our investors are the first pioneers that we're just giving them the token, and we're doing that. We're dangling that out there intentionally, like, okay, well, we're going to make your token inherit the security attributes. Well, show me in court case precedents where if I give a T-shirt, right, to my investors, that the T-shirt becomes the security as well, right? So it's going to stop that discussion, and then we will push onto public record in the form of a Form C filing, an acknowledgement from the SEC that, yes, this is a bona fide, valid utility application token structure that we can get away with in the United States. We can sell the tokens as a product. I can put a credit card processing form up on my website and actually sell stored computing capacity. The token that they get when they buy that token can only be traded in exchange for our internal value token, which may have a free open market. But guess what? Bitcoin does too.
Yeah.
So you can't stop us from doing that, because you got like already this precedence that are out there. All these other people have doing this.
I'll say the precedence is that every arcade I ever went to as a kid, where you go put your cash into, and you get those useless tokens that can only be used there. How is it different from that model?
It's casino chips, right?
There you go. Yeah.
I mean, that's right. So hopefully we will be pushing the definition. I've been working really close. We talked to the SEC Office of Chief Counsel a lot. Mm-hmm. I've been to DC a bunch of times. I literally have sat down with CTEC and the Capital Markets Group of the U.S. Chamber, and really press these issues, because we are being stymied by the rest of the world right now for technology innovation, and we're already having trouble with early seed stage capital formation. If you look at the numbers of the trending for early stage, the current VC model is broken for especially very early stage. And if we're not going to put money into innovation as a systematic form of capital formation, we've got like a really serious national issue. And, I talk about this all the time. It's like, what are we going to do? Are we just going to sit here and let South Korea and, Gibraltar and Malta and all these other companies become the conduits? And, it's like, well, you could still, do your deal offshore and then contract back the services to the U.S.-based company. I was like, yeah, but it's the capital appreciation. It's the growth of the capital that's really the important part of, the growth of the wealth. And this is going to impact us in 5, 7, 10 years down the road. And we're already sucking wind when it comes to early stage funding for early stage tech and projects. Yep. I don't know what we're going to do, but I know that I'm on a mission from God to, declare at least a form of utility token structure as a way for a blockchain software company to emphatically show. And we've gone to the trouble of actually creating a contract. So when, you go to the website, it goes live, the bearer of this token is entitled, there's legal language, there's legal evidence, just like any other services agreement that's tied to that. And if you own that token, then you're entitled to the services of the blockchain, just like any other. Now, there's going to be questions around unincorporated association and the liability that's, inherited by everybody. But I think those things will get sorted out, right? It's just people can't conceive that you can create this functional transactional financial entity where there's no board of directors, right? There's no centralized hierarchy of management. And that's probably, it's back to the consortium, and saying, well, the tech is really only 15, 20% of the equation. It's back to organization design and all those other things.
Right.
And there are no clear-cut answers, and it's still a big risk. But at least if, I can, stake my claim. I was like, hey, we were one of the first to actually define this utility token structure. And it's so stupid because, I don't have on my desk here, but to log into my bank account, I use an RSID, right? I mean, we've been using tokens for application access and functions for how long?
I had that in mid '90s. When I was interacting with working working for the phone company for Pacific Bell, for Pacific Telesys Shared Services Organization, working with all the Bell properties.
Right.
But everything was token accessed because I was working with the data centers, and that was the only way that you could log into those. Right?
Yeah. And it's funny because I actually asked the Office of Chief Counsel, I said, okay, let me get this straight. If I buy a share of Apple stock, does that make the iPhone a security? And it was like, dead air.
Michael, I know that it's we could have it. I'm sure we'll have other conversations around these topics. Yeah. I mean, going down like that discussion. There's a couple of folks I'd like to maybe have a panel discussion on in a future date. But
love to do it.
Michael, I really appreciate your time today. And one more time, how can people get in touch with you?
So Michael Hiles is my name, Hiles, at Michael Hiles on Twitter. And you can hit me at 10xts, 10xts.com.
Excellent. Well, hey, thanks a lot for your time today. And we'll talk to you soon.
Right on.